Here he is.
Oh, hey.
He's
what's up?
real.
What's going on?
Yeah, so Ken has decided to grace my family with his presence, and also our other friend here.
Yes.
So yeah, I just listened to The Fourth Turning by Neil Howe and William Strauss. So maybe I'll go through some of the points that were made in that book, and Ken can riff off of it. So you've read this book? You've heard of this book?
I've heard of the general principle, but refresh my memory.
Okay, so the idea is that every 80 years or so, society goes through some kind of crisis and reformulation. And 4 generational archetypes are created by the timing of this event in the lifespan of the people involved. So when World War II happened, this was the crisis at the end of the preceding 80-year period that began with the Civil War, and the beginning of the current saeculum. That's the term that they use for this 80-year span of time. The saeculum then has 4 periods, a kind of spring, summer, autumn, winter dynamic, and the 4 generational archetypes that come about with the crisis and play different roles during these 4 kind of ages of the saeculum are the prophet, the nomad, the hero, and the artist. So in terms of the current generations, the boomers are the prophet, the Gen X are the nomads, millennials are the hero, and Gen Z is the artist. Silent generation would have been artist. The generation before them would have been the hero. The GI generation is the hero. So the people who are young adults from like 20 to 40 approximately when the crisis happens, they're the ones who have to actually do the fighting. If it's a war, they have to engage and solve, and they're active, heroic archetypes. The kids who are coming up during the crisis, who experience the hardship, are kind of in awe of the older generations who actually solved the situation. And so that's the silent generation. They're also the artist archetype. They have low expectations early in life. They have thrift, and they want to contribute to society. They have pro-social values, not totally self-absorbed like boomers. And they are artists because they kind of set themselves into fixed roles where they are expert technicians. They want to get things done in the social order, but not this kind of big vision that the prophet generation has, or like heroic activity that the hero generation has. The midlife people, middle-aged people during the crisis, they are more in the vein of like kind of filling out the practical necessities during the crisis, and the older generation during the crisis is that prophet archetype. So in the way it's supposed to work, the prophets during the crisis give the orders, and the heroes during the crisis follow the orders. The middle generation there, which is the nomad generation, nomad archetype, they're more the technicians filling out administrative functions. And then the artist generation, after the crisis, in the new birth of the social order, they go on to kind of build out the new order, following the archetype laid down by that prophet, who was the older generation during the crisis. So I think this cycle is effectively broken. It's not universal. They trace it through Anglo history in England, and going all the way back to the colonial period in America. But it seems to me that the millennials are not actually living up to a heroic archetype. During the heroic rise, you're supposed to see more conservative values, more defined gender roles, more pro-social, less egotistical values. And we're not seeing that. So I think basically what's happened is the Gen X nomad archetype has extended through a lot of the millennials, And the Gen Z, if anyone's going to fill up that heroic archetype, it's going to be Gen Z, and I also don't think it's very likely to happen with them. So I think the kind of demographic shift that's happened in the country has made it very unlikely that we're going to have this kind of rallying around a new social order, high trusting institutions. So I'm almost done kind of giving the exposition, and then we'll go into dialogue about this. But briefly, the ages of the saeculum. The spring is right after the crisis. Things have been simplified. The social order is kind of militant in a way, highly organized. People think about what they can do for the country, not for themselves. They call this the high. The spring is the high period. High trust in institutions, pro-social values. The next phase is the kind of awakening period. That's when you get, following a crisis about 20 years in Anglo history, you get some kind of religious revival or otherwise a revolution in consciousness. In our case, it was the hippie movement and anti-war movement, equal rights era, civil rights era, and the boomers come of age. They're young adults in that period, and that's why they're the prophet generation, because they're the leaders of this kind of thought revolution. And that the reason this dynamic takes place is the heroic generation that solved the last crisis, the GIs in our case. They are revered by all of society, except eventually their own children, who come up and realize the hypocrisy of the heroic generation in various ways. Like, we went to defeat fascism, the Nazis were evil because they're authoritarian and racist. And then the boomers come up and say, no, you're the fascists, you're authoritarian and racist. And so then the civil rights area is anti-collectivist, pro-individual rights, free expression, like all of these things. They see this hypocrisy and want to correct for it. Generally, they're going to overcorrect. And what's thrown our saeculum off is the introduction of this multiracial component, because you're just never going to get the kind of coming together at the end of a saeculum if you have literally just different national groups in a single political order. It's more likely we would see, if this cycle continued, the crisis at the end being some kind of civil war and fragmentation. But so that high is the consciousness revolution. That's the second 20 years of the saeculum. The third is the unraveling. So in our case, that's like 85 to 2005 rather. And that's like culture wars, different ideological camps, kind of resolving the tensions in argument between the values of the beginning of the social order, the GI values, and the values of the Great Awakening, the hippie values. And so those work themselves out. Society becomes disunified, trust in institutions lessens, and so at the end of that period, the unraveling, you have the fourth turning, which is the crisis period. There's a catalyst at the beginning of the fourth turning. In our case, it was something like 9/11. It exposes the weakness of the social order, the disunity, and that's supposed to instigate some kind of self-reflection, stripping down of unnecessary luxuries. Conservative values come back, so gender roles are strengthened, nuclear families are strengthened, and then the society is ready for the end of the fourth turning. The final catalyst, the final crisis should take place. So that's the cycle, and I don't think we're gonna make it as America. I don't think this is an entirely natural cycle. My own kind of conspiracy theory about it is that it's engineered. It's probably engineered during the Elizabethan period. Maybe Francis Bacon is involved, who knows. But this would be the kind of technology, a generational cycle, that you would expect an ancient ruling elite to really know. Like, how do you control masses? You create these generational archetypes, make the dynamics predictable, create crises at key historical moments, and that creates a kind of social rhythm that's predictable that you can work with as the authority. So Like, do you think this basically holds as far as you can think about it? And
when you say
let's
that
switch positions.
we've been thrown off by multiracialism, I disagree with that. I think the advent of television and later the internet is more disruptive than multiple races living in the same country, and we had a great deal of cohesion, especially look at the Confederacy in the South. You had a very strong culture that was set up there, and you had a much more multiracial society than you do otherwise. Am I even in the frame right now?
No, I'm just trying to get the mic close to you.
You're trying to get the dog there.
There he is, following us. Oh, it'll be all right.
Anyway, yeah, so, I mean, I agree that I don't especially look at the millennials as he's a good German Shepherd. He's just checking us out.
Yeah, we're good.
Dutiful. We have some very disruptive things going on that mean that millennials and Gen Z probably are not going to rise to the heroics of the GIs. And I suppose before that you would have had the men who fought in the Civil War, and before that I guess it would have been the Revolutionary War. But yeah, I mean, I can't imagine people rising to the conflict and the challenge of what we now have is this culture war that everyone assumes is going to become a physical conflict. And I do believe it will be a low-grade physical conflict that we saw in Rome when you had different bands of political factions engaging in street fighting prior to and around the time of Caesar. That is, you're going to continue to see that, but that was not the cause of the ultimate civil wars that ensued in Rome. That was inspired by the fractionalism of those elites. And one of the things that I believe about the current structure of society, the way that it is administered, is that those who view themselves as societal administrators are remarkably in lockstep. And I suppose Trump, in some ways, was egregious in that he moved back to a more Clintonian style of government, which is not in vogue. And that was, in some ways, reacted to very pugnaciously with many polemics. The problem with that is if you lived through George Bush, you realize that America is, as the Egyptians said of the Greeks, we have a very poor memory in this country. We used to have a better teaching of history at large, but now I think that's confined to a certain academic class. And the average person believes that, you know, before Donald Trump, everything was happy in this country. I remember the hatred of George Bush, and I remember the superficiality of the disagreement between the Republicans and Democrats.
Let's turn back here. This is going to get slippery.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think it is, the conflict as it is not the type of organic conflict that results in this kind of necessary war. I think it is a mechanism of control to get people focused on things like multiracialism, like, you know, differences on healthcare policy, and, oh, you want to kill my grandma because you don't agree with my healthcare plan. And it gets people fighting amongst themselves. It's a mechanism of control, and I think they can drag it on for quite a while. The only reason it didn't go on endlessly in Rome is because a man like Caesar decided to take power. He made the decision, maybe out of egoism, and maybe you could say in a Trumpian way, that he wanted to see himself as, you know, divine in his own right. And so he went about to smash that system. He didn't complete the work, but it did establish a new formulation of society. Is there any chance that an Elon Musk or a Donald Trump or someone in that vein could become like Caesar? One of the issues is that Caesar was not alone, and that he had the structure of the military behind him. And when you look at the military today and the technological changes, it's hard to imagine that the military is going to go in the direction of Francoism, of Hindenburgism, and all of the various other 20th century parallels that you can take. And I don't know how you will return to that. With the concentration of wealth, certainly I believe there are hard times coming for many people economically. I don't think the situation is going to get better for the majority of the people. When you look at the stock market, it has almost completely diverged. You know, before you could say, well, wages are stagnant and the stock market is rising. But now real wages are really falling and the stock market is continuing to skyrocket. With that kind of wealth dynamic, I think you're going to have a situation where the military is essentially this knightly class which has total supremacy, and the people by comparison have no recourse. You're seeing that with the militarization of the police. And again, when you look at something like a Derek Chauvin scenario, the complaint there is ultimately not that the police are they're too brutal, but that they are not thoroughly enough ideological. If Derek Chauvin had his foot or knee on the neck of a white supremacist, then that would not only be acceptable, but if it didn't happen, the question would be, well, why not? You know, so that kind of brutality, it's almost, when it's displayed in that manner, I think a lot of people think it is a protest against the act itself, but I think it's more a protest against the direction of the act and who should be the scapegoat in our society and what is the moral paradigm that we follow. So, I mean, if anything's going to come out of the coming millennial and Zoomer generations, you could speak of a twisted heroism that I think is extremely moralistic, extremely ideological, that a very small percentage, just like the American Revolution was only 3% of the population, you're going to have, you know, the real 3%ers are not the guys who walk around open carrying at Trump rallies. It's going to be the 3%ers is the academic class that is absolutely ruthless in its commitment to destroying what it perceives as the old social norms. And it's a bulldozer, and there is no one really pushing back. There are people who hold firm, and there are people who facilitate the process, a la Charlie Kirk saying there are only two genders. You can choose to be male, you can choose to be female, but you have to ascribe to one of those two. That is the conservatism of the future. So there really is this is not a push and a pull. This is, one side is pushing, and one side is either sitting down or walking slowly. There's no pushback, and so you can't really get a war out of that. Even if there are people who would desire that, if it's not desired by an elite faction that wants to make it happen, then it's just going to be this kind of false heroism. It's very apt that we live in a culture surrounded by video games, where even, you've got 50-year-olds playing video games, because that's how we view political and ideological structure. It is a video game. You play with the same ferocity you would go to war with. You place as much importance on it as you would sports, but you're not, it's not going to ultimately evolve into the collapse or breakup of the United States in the next 100 years, in my estimation. But I could be wrong.
So going with the thesis, let's switch positions again. Going with the thesis that this cycle was socially engineered, if there was a civil war, that would be the kind of crisis that was chosen by an elite group. The thing about the World War II crisis is that it brought about a certain degree of synchronism between the generational cycles all around the world. And so boomer leaders or Gen X leaders in various countries will find that they have common values with people in different parts of the world. So if your goal was to bring about a new world order, the current saeculum would be the period of synchronizing this cycle all around the world, and it would have to be culminated with a global crisis. Now, COVID looks like that in a lot of ways, and what it's bringing about is this kind of streamlining that's supposed to happen during the fourth turning, this authoritarianism, trust in institution. Wearing the mask is displaying trust in an institution, and the argument is if you don't believe in science, if you don't support the WHO or Fauci, then you are like a bad person. So if you're not an authoritarian, you don't believe in the authority of science, you're a bad person. They want that moralism to get people into this collectivist mindset, a new kind of collectivism. But there has to be an enemy, I think, to have a firm ideological ground for the next saculum, for the new world order to really be globally affirmed. You have to have some kind of bad guy. And I think the way to enable that would be to echo the bad guy of the previous crisis. And there has been a theme from the Civil War to World War II to our current politics. Who is the bad guy? It is nationalism. So when I say multiracialism has upset this cycle, I mean in terms of the United States coming together as a nation. That's not possible due to the multiracial character of our society. I would just argue there are too many instincts involved to really have unification while having this multiracialism. The only way to really allow that would be to sacrifice a component of the multiracial distribution in the name of the well-being of the rest. And I think everyone knows what I'm talking about with that. Scapegoat them, basically put the sins of the saculum, the sins of our age on that group, and then push them ideologically into a position where they assume the contrarian position in the crisis that's going to come. And so if there was a civil war scenario, a breakup of the country, the conservative Americans would be the new Nazis, and their ultimate defeat would lead to a new globalist, open society, neoliberal order that moves past neoliberalism into a kind of economic feudalism. But looking back at the generational cycle, viewed from a global perspective rather than an American perspective, we are kind of on track to bring about that kind of new saculum, because we have seen since 2005 a streamlining of information. Now, people will say that, you know, there were only 3 major news networks on TV back in the 60s, and that's consistent with the ethos that existed in that civilizational high. People had high trust in the institutions back then. The media that we had served its generational purpose. In the next phase, consciousness revolution, television widened, increasing variation of available ideas, new thought spaces. You create a kind of market to bring about this dynamic quality that you need to then kind of extract the chosen elements of the new order out of that kind of churning dialectic of the consciousness revolution. And then in the unraveling, 85 to 2005, we have internet technologies and even television assuming a role of factionalization, breaking up society into individual camps, echo chambers being created. But since 2005, the Wild West of the internet kind of took a back seat. People were pushed into these, even in mainstream television, I feel that certain like epoch-making programs were significant for whole generations simultaneously, like a Game of Thrones or some of these big cultural experiences. Lord of the Rings, like initiating this age, I feel like that blockbuster, like shared cultural experience was bigger. I mean, even something like Avatar, bigger box office than in the past. Now, sure, it's a higher population and everything, but I just feel that media became more of a mass cultural event than during the great unraveling period, which is 65 to 85. Or sorry, 85 to 2005. Since 2005, media has been more about breaking up. Darn it, I keep on mixing up the dates here. since 85 it was breaking up. Since 2005 it's been more about controlling information flows, creating a mass culture, kind of mass media hypnosis, mind control, putting everyone in a similar thought space who was connected to this mainstream information flow. Internet technologies obviously controlling where people, who people see on social media. Social media at first was in the phase of the unraveling, creating your own niche communities, and then social media was redirected aggressively towards creating consensus, not just in America, but all over the world, creating a common kind of zeitgeist to take advantage of with the next crisis. But all the while, this kind of oppositional force has been propped up. I do think that the events of 2015, 2016, the dissident political movement that arose during that time, the nature of its spread, if not completely controlled by the globalist thinkers, was encouraged by them for a time. Like Peter Thiel, or is it Thiel or Thiel?
It's Thiel because he's German, but you know, the other example in the news is now it's on, you know, Ben Shapiro is being promoted on Facebook, so...
Right, yeah.
Things of that nature.
Peter Thiel has gone to Bilderberg. He is among their ranks, and he did support figures in that dissident movement, and you wouldn't have had the massive expansion if you didn't have a certain level of financing. Obviously, Richard comes to mind as a possible. I didn't used to think he was in with them, and maybe he's not, but he was a useful idiot for them, depending. I don't know how it went down ultimately, but my point is that these dissident communities have been solidified into a single force, a single scapegoat that society, the multicultural, multiracial society, can put all of their sins onto and then sacrifice at the end of this crisis period. And so if there is a civil war, it's not going to be a good thing for separatists. In the end, I've argued that the establishment is immeasurably better prepared for a civil war scenario than any dissident group.
And the problem with the term civil war is that's such a relative term. You know, you think of Mao's Cultural Revolution, and there's a sense in which you could say that was a civil war. And I believe that the propaganda at the time said we're going to war against these, you know, reactionaries who are trying to take over the government. Now, was there ever a chance of that happening? No. But it was created as a moral panic. And in the same way, you have the Capitol riots where the police open the doors and usher people in, and you're going to call that a revolution and terrorism and whatnot. And so you can manufacture a civil war that is not a civil war. You can say we had I believe it was the Bundy Ranch or the Bundy family where they occupied a federal building. You can take events like that, which are completely inconsequential, which do not threaten the power of the federal government, but is a horse and pony show, and you can encourage people to do that through federal entrapment schemes that they've honed over many years. And then you push that and you push that and you push that, and you get all these little battles. You get all these little fake, gunfights and whatnot, low-level street conflicts, and you can call that a civil war. And so you can basically manufacture it, and it actually doesn't require a real contest of power in the same way that Mao's revolution wasn't, the Cultural Revolution was not. But you can make it appear that way to both sides. You can make it appear that way to those who are obedient to the system and also to those who are outside the system, just like you have in Ukraine, the neo-Nazis running around thinking that they're gonna... I don't really know what they think, but they have these bizarre beliefs, but they're trapped inside that ideological prism where they feel that they have no outsideness to that. This is their identity. Ukraine is essentially a psychological testing ground, the same way I argue Vietnam and Afghanistan have been that way. Iraq to a lesser extent, now Syria, the whole Arab Civil War. These wars and conflicts are used to gather psychological data that can ultimately be employed at home and have been employed at home. The way that our government looks at veterans of the Army is as the highest risk category of terrorism. So that is a low-level psychological war against, the people who are the cannon fodder of the country. So they can manufacture things like the Capitol riot which were totally inconsequential, which were hyped up by the right wing as, oh, we're going to take back our government, this is awesome, this is cool, you know, we're revolutionaries, the democratic masses are rising up against the elites. Whoa, I'm going to slip here. I better watch myself. The point is, you could have something like the Capitol riots where people are, and maybe guns are involved, and there's casualties, and you can have that just like BLM went on for months and months and months. I also believe that was a template for this violence without violence. It is the appearance of violence without the consequence of a shift in power relations. Ultimately, things continue to go in the same direction. So you could have a conservative version of BLM, and the result would be the same. BLM did not threaten the power structure, and a conservative version of BLM would also not threaten the power structure. Conservatives will argue that BLM, they're not intelligent, whereas conservatives are intelligent. And therefore conservatives will, you know, when the conservatives decide to take to the streets, that's when everything real will go down. But the problem is that, unfortunately, masses can't lead themselves. And if they don't have a leadership that understands how power is actually gained, not really through riots in the streets and destroying buildings and burning down statues or whatever, if you don't have that, then ultimately the issue is there might be people in the country who are intelligent to understand that type of violence is not effective, but they are shouted out and crowded out by other voices which are promoted to glorify things like the Capitol riots, and then a couple weeks later say, oops, sorry I told you all to go there. It was actually a federal entrapment scheme, but trust me, I'm not a Fed. And in a sense, I do trust you. I think the right wing is immature, stupid. They don't know what they're doing. Very easily manipulated and controlled. That will continue to be the case. And those who wise up to the game and change their tune and try to do something productive, actually build your own structures of power rather than lashing out and giving the middle finger, which was the whole Trump movement. And then, of course, the follow-up, he was unable to appoint anyone effective, do anything effective. He built the wall. It's just going to be torn down, or a gate will be built. So if anyone changes their tune, they'll be shut out. They'll be drowned out. That's when the lawfare comes. That's when the lawsuits come. All those weapons makes it very difficult to get anything done. That's pretty much my tangent.
I think that's a good ending point.
Okay.
And so how millennials and Zoomers can respond to this, to somehow function as a hero generation, is to take advantage of the rhythm and nature of the saeculum as it has been instantiated by elites. So you have to play a kind of ideology, use their momentum. Filling the archetype of the villain that they've created is not going to help you. What you're looking for is a collectivist spirit that at the same time embraces the individual freedom and expression that we had during the hippie movement as the key values. How do you synthesize those? Well, on the one hand, you can have the kind of mass multiculturalism, enforced mass authoritarian multiculturalism that tries to smush those together. Or you could, in principle, have an alliance of groups from different backgrounds that each embrace a collectivist spirit in their own right. They create some kind of cooperative framework. So the way to do that would be to use technologies that exist right now, have a network of communities of different individual compositions collaborating in an economic paradigm that tries to go around the current kind of neo-feudalism that's slowly being rolled out as the next paradigm at a global scale. And of course, the elites would be using UBI, pushing people into smart cities, replacing workers. The alternative to that would be not to use UBI, but more of a distributivist strategy where you offer people nature, land, community, organic values. But you have to do that in a way that allows for a multicultural coalition and a global coalition, because no individual national actor can do something here. And furthermore, nationalism as a whole is just not tenable long term for the planet. As long as you have different sovereign nations with the ability to go to war, eventually we're going to kill ourselves. You may disagree with that, but I've never heard a good counter argument. Nukes are just one step up in the technological ladder from TNT. What's 3 steps up? What's 5 steps up? What's the weapon of mass destruction of the 22nd century? If you have individual nations exercising that kind of power, eventually the wrong button is going to get pushed and we could all go up. We don't want that, and so some kind of global cooperation is necessary. The only form that I see being possible coming out of this is either what the globalists are offering to us, or a version that we create ourselves that has some of the spirit of what they're creating. That is a multicultural aspect, but instead of having one mass multiculturalism, have many cultures with a framework of cooperating, embracing individual decisions to be part of collectives. And that's the synthesis that we've yet to really make, partly, as Ken was saying, because the oppositional voices have been led in a certain direction to make them easy scapegoats. We don't want to do that. So I think this analysis was pretty good, in fact, that we just did. There's probably more to look into, more about the generational cycles as well, how you promote a message like what I just outlined to boomers, Gen X, millennials, and zoomers, according to their own experience, according to where they are. So it's a mixed bag with the Strauss-Howe model, but it's a useful heuristic in some ways. So let me know what you think in the comments, and we'll probably do another collaboration. I've been walking for too long, I'm getting winded. Another collaboration later on.
This is a mountain, by the way.
Yeah.
Okay? Very slippery.
Okay,
I'm
so
not out of shape.
All right.
we might have a follow-up.